Hello, this is the second part of the work that you're going to complete to start into your first unit in psychology. I have to stress that this is going to be a little dense with scientific discussion, and then we're going to start to branch into how it encompasses the idea of psychology. So for the first unit, we're going to talk about the parts of what are neurons, and then later on, we're going to talk about parts of the brain and their function. The reason why we do this with the science side of it is because this quote is used in one of the videos. Everything psychological is biological. Your brain chemical makeup and electrical connections and all of those facets that make up you lead to aspects that we'll talk about later in the course dealing with things in psychology such as consciousness, sensation, perception, cognition, and disorders and aspects of therapy. So for this task, it's going to be very straightforward. There are going to be three resources I'm going to ask you to access. One is an article on neurons from Very Well Mind. A second one is a video, which is literally 2 minutes, and he describes the neuron, parts of it. And finally, it's going to be a crash course psychology called The Chemical Mind. And I'm going to ask you as you watch them, there are key terms that are described and discussed in how neurons work. And so what's going to break apart for you is I'm going to ask you to take notes using all of these resources. I will remind you that these sources, many of them will cover these topics more than once, and you should try to get as descriptive of a definition as you can to describe what the function is of these particular aspects of what makes up a neuron. It's going to be quick and dense, and it is going to require you to kind of think about how it works. I would encourage you read the sources, take the notes, and then from there, I will also say they do not go in any particular order. So before you go into a source, I would look at the list over and over again and say, okay, some of the sources don't have all of these terms in them. They have a couple of them. So just be mindful of that as you go forward. And there's not an order to any of them. So you're going to have to scroll up and down as you do this, and you can type your notes directly in this document. Now, part of what is released from a neuron, two neurons actually do not, they're very close to touching, but they don't. So if you take your hands right now and make two fists, and actually push your fists together so that they barely touch each other. So your hands are like towards each other and they're barely touching each other. Imagine the gap between that area of your two fists that are made, your two hands, is the neural connection that's being formed. And you're going to talk about what is the synapse and the synaptic gap. And once again, if you can't visualize this, let's set up some video conferencing. But what is released between those two neurons is something called the neurotransmitter. So the neuron is the actual distribution connection. The neurotransmitter is the chemicals that are released between neurons. And there are many different types of them. The 6 that we're going to focus on in this class is the aspect of what is acetylcholine, dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, GABA, and glutamate. For the videos, and this is really important, I'm going to highlight this for this reason. They are not going to talk about the malfunctions. I am going to share a chart with you that will actually have the malfunctions in them, which is what happens when the neurotransmitters don't fire, when there's too much, when there's too little. What are some of the results of that malfunction? And I'm going to share that with you next week. We're going to have a lesson on neurotransmitters and their malfunctions. So please, this part of the chart, you do not have to fill in for this week. So you can just leave it blank. We're going to come back to this worksheet for the neurotransmitter malfunction activity. And then what you're going to do is you're actually going to do your first writings with the SOTA strategy, and you're going to use the neurotransmitters as your way to do that. So once again, for this task, you're only filling in the function, and they're very quickly mentioned in the Chemical Mind video. So you're not going to have an exhaustive definition here. It's just going to be quick. So don't be worried if you don't have a lot of notes for your neurotransmitters. I just want to introduce you to them. And then finally, the endocrine system is going to be discussed, which is one of the most important systems in relation to the development of your brain and body. We're going to go a little more in depth with this as we get to the parts of the brain, but you can define what these terms are: hormones, adrenal gland, and pituitary gland. And then we'll get into them a little bit as we get closer to our aspect of talking about how the brain works with parts of the bodies and those neural connections. So once again, just fill in the definitions to have them as a working understanding. And as the weeks unfold, we will come back to these topics. The last thing I'm going to ask you to do, and now this is going to be two things that you can do. You can actually use Google Draw, which is an app in Google if you'd like, and your mouse can work. Or you can do it on paper and then send me a picture if you'd like. I would like for you to draw, and the videos do this for you as well, so feel free to use those. I would like you to draw a simplistic neuron and label each of the parts of the neuron. You can create more than one picture if you need to, but I want you to take these terms from the first chart, all of these that I'm highlighting right now: neuron, dendrite, soma, axon, axon potential, threshold, synapse, neurotransmitter, reuptake, myelin sheath, axon terminal, synaptic gap, receptor site, axon hillock, and terminal buttons. And I'd like you to create some images where you would label the parts of the neuron based on those terms and functions. The goal of doing this, many of you said you're visual learners, and if you're not, well, then this is a task. I'm not looking for art perfection. And if you would prefer not to have to, like I said, do it on the computer, you can draw it on paper and then just attach an image or send me an image through email. But the reason why I'm having you do this is I want you to take those terms to show me that you understand how a neuron works. Now, this is not a biology course. We're not going to have a memorization test on all these pieces. What we are going to talk about, though, are how these pieces make up the biological aspects of how your brain works. So when we get to later discussions of aspects of disorders and malfunctions and such like that, we can draw back to this knowledge of neurons and neurotransmitters to understand why some people think and see the world differently than others. And that's the intention of why we're learning this. So once again, your task is to use all three sources that are listed. You can either open them directly from this document, or I'll have them attached into Classroom as well, and you can open them one at a time and fill in the function of all of these parts of what make up a neuron or neurotransmission. And they do not go in order. You're not going to list, some of them are not in some of the resources, or one of them is only mentioned in one of the resources. So that's why you need to make sure you look at all three of them. Once you finish that, I'm going to ask you to have a little bit just with up through the terminal buttons. So the neurotransmitters and the endocrine system, you do not need to draw. So everything from terminal buttons up, and you're actually drawing the neuron, so you don't really have to draw a neuron, but I want you to draw the parts of a neuron and label them in a couple pictures to show me you understand how the process works. This is part of how psychology is going to work, and I know this can be frustrating for some of you, is we have to lay out what is first before we can talk about how it works and how to apply it. Psych 2 was a little more, if you took it, was a little more open-ended, whereas we're looking more at the biological side in Psych 1, and that's why we're laying the foundation. And if you didn't take Psych 2, then all you're getting is science. Once again, if you have any questions, let me know. All of this work is due by Friday by midnight, so please make sure to complete both tasks and let me know if you have any question or want to meet via video conferencing. Remember, my office hours are listed in Classroom as part of that first announcement, as well as the checklist for all of the work that you need to complete by Friday. Good luck, take your time, you can do this.